is democracy. That used to be a goal of the left, but the left has become totalitarian.
Yeah, and that was exactly my question. And like you say, it started to conserve the Western values that we cherish. And so you write in Management of Reality, Fransisco, you write that the democratic simulation is ending. That's a very strong statement. And so my question that emerged from that is, do you think that Israel, right now with the war with Hamas and the potential war of escalating, do you think Israel is the last line for defense for the West and for democracies? And what would happen if Israel falls?
Okay, so thank you for this question. It's a very important question. I think the way to answer it is the first thing people should do is they should think back to World War II, right? Because but World War II, it's not the only case. I can give you many examples, and if time permits, I will. But it's the recent case. It's the one that people are most familiar with, and it's a very dramatic case. So think back to World War II. What we saw in World War II is that the people who were hell-bent on murdering the Jewish people in Europe were very bad for all of us. You see, this is the thing that people really need to understand. The Nazis were very bad for all of us. I'm not Jewish. People ask me, well, why are you expending so much energy defending the Jews? You're not even Jewish. And I'm like, dude, I'm not. This is not an act of charity. I'm defending myself. This is self-defense. This is Western self-defense. Anti-Semitism is a danger to the West. We saw it in World War II. So the anti-Semites, the people that wanted to kill all of the Jews, what did they do? They plunged us into a world war. The entire planet was sucked into their war. The anti-Semites are very bad for us. Very, very bad for us. All of us, whether Jewish or not. So between 5 and 6 million Jews were murdered in Europe in Shoah, in the Holocaust. But of course, that's very important. We can't forget that. Never again. I agree with that. But it's also important to remember that more than 64 million non-Jews were also killed in that war. And hundreds of millions of non-Jews were enslaved, lost all of their rights and liberties, right? Who did that to them? The anti-Semites. My God, how is it possible that people can't learn this lesson? The anti-Semites are a danger to all of us because anti-Semitism is the tool of totalitarian expansion. That's what anti-Semitism is, and it has been that for a very long time. Very long time. So if you go back in time to the late 19th century, early 20th century, who was killing lots of Jews? The Russian Empire. What was the Russian Empire? It was an autocratic, quasi-totalitarian nightmare. That's what the Russian Empire was. You go further back, who's killing the Jews? The Inquisition. Right? And who's running the Inquisition? Anti-Semites. They're organizing mass killings, forced conversions, expulsions of Jews, and they're also oppressing everybody else. All of the Christians were oppressed by the Inquisition, the Catholics and the Protestants, and before that the Proto-Protestants. Everybody was oppressed. Anti-Semites are a danger to everyone. The modern West was created by a rebellion against the anti-Semitic ruling elites of the Western world. That's how the modern world was created. Now you go even further back to the Roman Empire, and you find the Roman Empire committing genocide against the ancient Jews, and the Roman Empire was also enslaving everybody. You see, so this is a pattern. This is a pattern. Anti-Semitic, and the Roman Empire was totalitarian. So it's perfectly consistent. Perfectly consistent. And now we have Islam, the forces of radical Islam, calling for another genocide, preparing for another genocide, hell-bent on another genocide of the Jews. And what do they want for us? They also want to oppress us. All of us non-Jews, they consider us infidels. And they'll start with the Jews, just like the Nazis started with the Jews. But that's not where it's going to stop. They're coming for us. So we need to wake up to what's been happening in the West. The ruling elites of the West, the power elites of the West, have been importing the most radical Muslims into Europe and into the U.S. All of these mosques that have been going up in Europe have been built by the most radical Muslim states, by Qatar and Kuwait, I don't know how to pronounce it, Saudi Arabia, even Iran, but Turkey, which has had an Islamist government for a long time now. So all of these mosques have been built by radical Muslim states. The clerics in those mosques, this is not exactly a secret, have been preaching jihad against the European infidels. So our power elites have been doing the exact opposite of what we should be doing. Our relationship to Islam should be as a refuge for people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali. We should be the refuge where people who want to escape the slavery of the Islamic world can come here into the West and be protected by us and flourish with us in liberty and democracy. That's what the relationship of the West to Islam should be, not Western academics and governments apologizing for Islam and allying with Muslim states. No. The relationship should be the kind of relationship that was at least formal between the countries that were trapped behind the Iron Curtain and the Western free world. We were a refuge for, this was happening all the time when I was a kid. The Soviet athletic stars would travel to another country in the West to compete or whatever, and it was very common that one or two or maybe an entire group of them would escape. They would escape their jailers and defect. We called it defect. They would defect to the West, and then they would be protected in the West, and we wouldn't give them back. Right? To me, as a child, that was incredibly powerful. It made me realize that the Soviet Union was a gigantic prison. Because the most celebrated people in the Soviet Union were trying to get out. Their star athletes who were treated as heroes inside the Soviet Union, they didn't want to be in there. They wanted to be in the United States or in Western Europe, right? So that's the relationship we should have with the Islamic world. We should be the refuge for the people who want to escape. And this is something that Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's been doing a tremendously good job of speaking to Westerners about Islam, right? That's what she's been trying to communicate, because she took refuge in the West. But the West has gotten so bad that Ayaan Hirsi Ali had to escape the Netherlands to the United States because radical Islamists were hunting her down in the Netherlands. Wow. Right? Because so many radical Muslims have entered Europe and begun to transform Europe. So I think that's the realization people need to have. They need to realize that anti-Semites, whether in Nazi form, whether in radical Muslim form, whatever form they take, the anti-Semites are bad for you. How can we not have learned this after World War II? It's just incredible. And the other side of this coin is that the Jews are good for us. There's a reason the anti-Semites in power want to kill the Jews. It's that the Jews invented liberal politics. People don't realize what they're reading when they read the Bible. The story of the origin of Jewish law, the political context of the origin of Jewish law is a slave revolt, a slave revolution. The Israelites were slaves of Pharaoh. And they staged the revolt with the help of God and so on, according to the story, right? But the important context is they were slaves. And once they revolted and escaped Egypt into the Sinai desert, then they received a new law. What is this new law for? Well, this is the law of the escaped slaves. The whole point of the law is to make sure that people will not be oppressed again. So, of course, there's very careful, explicit protections for widows and orphans and poor people. There's very careful separation of powers. The priests cannot own land. Also, the king cannot be a priest, and so forth. So they separate political from religious power, from economic power, so to make it harder for people to get oppressed. They created the law creates a huge body of lawyers, the rabbis whose job is to make sure that people's rights are respected. The Jewish movement was moving society towards the total abolition of slavery. They are the original abolitionist movement. There is a category of slavery of slave in Jewish law, or it's a bit of a mistranslation because the so-called slaves could only be slaves for a period of 6 years. On the sabbatical year, they had to be freed, and even while they were really indentured servants. But while they were indentured servants because they were paying maybe a debt or expiating some crime or whatever, they couldn't be mistreated. And any evidence of mistreatment would immediately get them freed. There's a law that says if you're missing a tooth because your master mistreated you, automatically you go free. Right? They couldn't beat you, and they couldn't disrespect you either, because another law says that if you're a slave and you run away and you take refuge in somebody else's house, by law they cannot return you. They have to protect you. And then in the Talmud, these laws became even more compassionate. So the Talmud says that I believe this is Kedushin. It says that. Kedushin 28, I believe. I'll check it, but I believe that's where this quote comes from. They say the conditions of the slave should be identical to those of the master. So if you're breaking the law, if the slave's bed is inferior to yours, if your slave's bed is inferior, if the slave is eating worse than you are, you're breaking the law. The Kedushin 28 says that the conditions of the slave have to be equal to the master's. Well, that means they're abolishing slavery. That's what it means, right? So we have been under a process of increasingly effective Jewish influence for 2,500 years in the West. And what the Jews have done to the West is absolutely unbelievable. It's incredible. It's a miracle. The Jews started with the worst societies on earth. Greco-Roman societies of antiquity were absolutely the worst societies on the planet. They weren't throwing innocent people to the circus to be eaten by lions for the entertainment of the ruling elite in China. They were doing that in the West. The West was the worst place on earth. It was run by a psychotic ruling class that thought it was fun to watch an innocent human being just burst in blood because a lion was digging its jaws into him or her, right? And they thought it was fun to have human beings fight like a cockfight of human beings fighting to the death in front of them and then cheering like animals. That was the psychotic ruling class of the West. Those are the ruling classes that our corrupt educational system teaches us to admire. We're supposed to admire the Greeks and Romans for their political. I don't mind admiring them for the scientific achievements. Those are objective. They're non-controversial. But they teach us to admire them also for their political achievements. And they tell us that the Greeks and the Romans invented democracy. Bullshit. These are the societies that supposedly invented democracy in the Western narrative that people learn in school. And what they're not learning is the true story, that Western democracy is a consequence of the Jewish principle, which then becomes a Judeo-Christian principle, that every individual human being is equally worth in the eyes of God. That principle, that we all have equal worth in the eyes of God, is the essential principle you need to establish a modern democracy. Equality under the law. Because that's what makes us all voters. It's what means that it's what makes us all capable of suing each other in the courts and so forth. That principle, equality under the eyes of God, which is the same thing as equality under the law when this becomes politics, that comes from the Jews. Rabbi Hillel the Elder, the most important rabbi in all of history, because Hillel the Elder is the origin of all of Jewish jurisprudence. So all of the secondary halacha, all of the law that was developed in response to real life situations and changing historical circumstances, and specific experiences that people were having, disputes that needed to be resolved, and that required that you derive a specific secondary law from the Constitution, which is the Torah. All of that stuff, which is fundamental to Jewish civilization, all of that stuff has its origin in Hillel the Elder, because the Mishnah is, which is the beginning of Jewish jurisprudence, starts with him. Now, he said, Hillel the Elder said, that all of Jewish civilization is based on the commandment Leviticus 19:18, which states, love your brother as you love yourself. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. This is Hillel, the most important rabbi of all time, said, look, our entire system of thought is based on this one commandment. And everything else is just details about how to apply this commandment. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's the essential ingredient for democracy, because if you love your neighbor as you love yourself, then of course everybody should have the vote. Of course different identities should be tolerated. Of course we should talk to each other gently and live in peace and try to help each other. And that's what democratic Western peoples have been trying to do ever since the revolutions of 1848 finally defeated the feudal order that had been subjugating us for so long. Right? So the future of the West, in my view, the defense of the West, which is going on, the West is being defended. People should not despair. Don't despair. The West is being defended. We are defending it. The podcast revolution is evidence that the West is being defended, and that we have a way of talking to each other now, thanks to the new technologies, even though they're trying to censor them, but they haven't been terribly effective yet. And we have ways of talking to each other. You and I are doing it right now. And we are defending the West. And more people can join us. Don't despair. There is still time. But we do have to work together. And I believe the future of the West depends on people realizing that the thing that kills the West is anti-Semitism. And because it's the tool of totalitarianism. We saw it in World War II recently. It's so clear. It's unbelievable. We're seeing it again with radical Islam. So what people need to realize is that fighting anti-Semitism is the same thing as fighting for yourself. It's the same thing as fighting for the future of the West. It's not a gift to the Jews. You're not doing them a favor. You're doing yourself a favor. Once Westerners understand that, once they understand that fighting anti-Semitism is fighting for their own selves, for their families, for their country, for the future of their civilization, then the West will survive. But that's what we need to, that's the message we need to communicate to people.
Wow, that message is heard loud and clear, and like you say, it's pretty.